back to Haunted and Historic Australia for our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts episodes, and our last episode in our Sydney Park Serial Killer series. Yes, our lucky 13th episode. We bring a close to the series with the suspects that came with each murder. Each murder had a few, mostly men, that seemed to be the true culprit, or at least the best fit for the murder. We will go through the murder of each of our 12 victims and size up the killer. To start, we go back to episode 1, which featured May Miller, or Iris Marriott as she was born. This tale was a clean cut. Working girl meets hopeless male who has a hard-on but can't pay. She retaliates more than she should, which turns into her own demise. The lady protests too much, and the man in this case was stronger. Why was this a serial killer episode? Well, that brings us to episode 2. Eric Craig, who's allegedly confessed to murdering May, is now also charged with the murder of Bessie O'Connor, episode 2. Bessie, a 16-year-old swim champion, is murdered on a night out trying her hand at making a few bucks by selling herself to men. Young, naive and inexperienced at this, she may or may not have known her murderer. The way she was murdered was much like May's death. They were both hit over the head hard and found nude. Eric Roland Craig was charged with 2 counts of murder. Through it all, Eric Craig's wife Mary was dragged into all the trials, stating that her husband didn't leave home after about 8 p.m. the night that Bessie O'Connor was murdered. She believed it couldn't have been him. She stuck by him as best she could, even though witnesses came forward and pointed him out of the lineup, stating that he was the man they all saw that night. There was so much surrounding false evidence to try and get Eric off that it dug his hole deeper. So episode 1, solved. Episode 2, solved also, although many debate this. His 20-year sentence was changed to sentence to death after the jury finds him guilty. It was then later commuted to life in prison. She hung on for about 10 years before getting a divorce. And then sadly, by 1950, even after being remarried for 2 years and having 2 children to Eric Craig, she committed suicide in her Randwick apartment. She was found with a head in the oven and gas throughout the house. Just 7 years after she'd taken her life, Eric Craig was released from prison after he was considered completely rehabilitated. Tanya Bretherton, author of The Killing Streets, states that his probation period ended around the beginning of 1963, and another woman was murdered just a year later. It was 17-year-old Barbara Judith Macken, who was hitchhiking in 1964. She was picked up in Granville, hitchhiking to the city, by a man in a truck. She was taken to the Prospect Creek in George's Hall, where she was beaten to death and thrown into the Prospect Creek. Barbara's murder was very similar to that of May Miller and Bessie O'Connor, and she hints that Eric Craig could have had something to do with it. Although another man was picked up, and when he was questioned, he stated he had no recollection of what happened. He said he didn't mean to murder her, and the whole thing is a blank in his mind, which is very similar to what Eric Craig said in court. Isn't that interesting? Eric Craig goes on to change his name and settles somewhere around the Marylands area, which isn't that far from where Granville is. But he also is supposedly remarried, and I can't find any information about his death, possibly because his name's changed. Very interesting indeed. Next episode features Hilda White, New Zealand born and had only been in the country a short time. Only just losing a sister a few months before, she kept high spirits and went to the movies with men she'd met. No confirmation she was a working girl. She seems to have been last seen with a Victor Francis Lamberto, but with insufficient evidence, he was acquitted of the murder. Episode 4 brought the death of Vera May Sterling, a middle-aged woman who had retired from hooking only to become a drunk. Despite again the victim being seen with a man, there was no clear suspect and she was left unsolved. Episode 5 was the death of Rebecca May Anderson, a woman like a few others married off young to an older man. Through drink she found comfort, although who she drank with led to her death. Like Vera, she was spotted with men before her death. Despite detailed descriptions, they could not find her murderer. Daisy was our episode 6, which was quite a strange one. Buried in a golf course for a year or so before her true story came to light. Husband, boyfriend, or serial killer? Harassed and beaten by her husband, she fled him for a better life. Although she picked badly because her next boyfriend, John Carl Jensen, wasn't much better. 2 witnesses emerged who saw her last moments. Yet one pointed out the husband and the other the boyfriend. Who murdered Daisy? Well, that'll forever be a mystery. Episode 7 was Thomasina Pocock, or Sina for short. A similar life to Rebecca, both married early to men much older, and turning to drink, which led them to untold horror. Both were sexually assaulted with a weapon and had internal bleeding, which caused their deaths, probably in conjunction with shock and cardiac arrest. Too young for possibly Eric Craig, but definitely an opportunistic murderer. The man that found her, George Casper Watson, seemed fishy and unstable, but wasn't held accountable. Episode 8 was poor Betty van Tonder, a Dutch nursemaid from South Africa, migrating to Sydney with a family and then suddenly cutting them off and moving in with another family. Could her employer or ex-employer have had an affair and eliminated any risk? Or was she simply murdered by a park serial killer, most likely luring girls with their charismatic ways? Which brings us to Lucy at episode 9. Daughter to a well-known doctor and socialite herself, she was meant to get home to attend a play with a sister, but perhaps was lured off by a man. Her body was never found and therefore her murder does not exist. Was she accidentally mistaken for her second cousin of even higher social standing? Or was she simply murdered by a cold-blooded serial killer? Episode 10 was our little Joan Jin, lured by a young man who, like her little life, disappeared into thin air. Despite descriptions of the man who took her life and her innocence, he was never tracked down. Episode 11 was Ada Lambert, married a man 36 years older and only had 10 good years with her children before her husband was placed into an asylum and her children taken away. Despite having a stable job, she lived away from them and took up a hobby for herself. She may have been on the spectrum or suffered from a mental illness, as she was noticeably different, talking to herself most of the time. Murdered by a younger drunk man who just wanted to get laid, tricked her into joining him in a park and following him to her death. He couldn't stand her talking and muttering and permanently silenced her. They had their man but charged him with manslaughter. He was drunk. He didn't know what he was doing. Could he have been drunk enough to kill others too, while Eric Craig was still behind bars? And our last victim, Shirley Butler. Well, she never had a chance. Like many of the other girls, was so young and taken too soon. No life to speak of and a terrible end. Were all of them murdered by the same man? No, I don't believe so. Could some have been murdered by the same man? Absolutely. These murders were vile and disgusting, and yet some, perhaps, were murdered by morons who couldn't hold their liquor. Not all were sex workers, clearly, but all were treated as objects men or women could just discard. Sadly, they are almost forgotten now, so long ago, and unless you pick up a book like Killing Streets, you wouldn't hear about them at all. But that's why we have to tell these stories, good and bad, to keep the memory alive. We hope you enjoyed this series. We will have more on the way, including cold cases from all over Australia. We've given Sydney a hammering, but we do have tales from our other states. So stay tuned, like our episodes, and keep us coming back. Don't forget to subscribe to see more, and that notification bell will help you see them as we throw them out.